Hi, this is going to be a quick review for the exam. I'm going to go through some of the most important points that Susan Douglas makes. These are directly related to exam questions. So this will be the best kind of prep, a recap that I can do for you. I'm going to be repeating things that I said in the lecture already, but I think it'll help focus. You're going to be seeing this in a different medium on video as opposed to watching it live, so it'll give you a level, a degree of accuracy and sort of pointedness uh, that'll enhance what you saw in the lecture. Let me start. The first point that I want to make here, all of this again comes from the book. The first point is to talk about this issue again of language, but we're not talking about whether or not you know English or you know Italian or what your native language is. We're talking specifically about accent, how one speaks English, because it's presumed that you're speaking English in the United States when you're arriving in this country. We're talking again about the 1920s and more specifically the 1930s, when there had just recently been a huge influx of European immigrants coming from a variety of non-English speaking countries, Italy and Italy and Poland and a number of other countries in Europe. All of these countries brought with them sort of a linguistic fingerprint, an accent. The problem with that is that that accent brushed up against and ran counter to the dominant sort of accent in America. I mean the accent of those who were in power in particular, who tended to be white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So their slightly British inflected accent, it was sort of de facto the accent of power. I talked about in lecture how we have this experience today. We may speak in one sort of style when we're with our family, when we're in our neighborhood, and we may change that style when we're in the office, when we're going to a job interview, when we're trying to persuade people in positions of power. Well, that was dominant back in that era, way more important than now, because understand this is during the era partly of the Great Depression. And whether or not you got a job or whether or not you did get help from people in power wasn't a matter of pleasure or comfort. It was a matter of actual survival. With millions of people out of work, the opportunities were very slim. Especially for immigrant populations, it was terribly important in terms of trying to move up the social ladder. So accent was far more important than it is today, in fact. Accent defined, whether it was correct or not, defined your income largely. It seemed to indicate what your education level was. Though that might not be true, that was what it appeared to indicate. It indicated your ethnic background. It indicated your degree of assimilation. And assimilation was essential. In a word, accent determined power. So that's a very important first point to get across. The second point I want to make here, radio at this time period, still in its infancy and its youth, was drawing from other theatrical and artistic forms. In particular, the popular form of theater at that time, which was vaudeville. And of course, we know vaudeville has some of its roots in minstrelsy. Vaudeville was noted for being a form of theater that had a lot of variety. There were magicians, musicians, dancing girls, animal acts, comedians, sketch comedians, and so on. And the kind of humor that was popular at that time, the physical humor, was called slapstick. Most notably sort of embodied by, well, as we know, the Three Stooges and folks who later went out into the movies and television to be very big. Rough, brusque, witty slapstick. Susan Douglas talks she's invented a term here which she calls linguistic slapstick, meaning a form of humor that relies on wisecracks and catchphrases and wordplay. Linguistic slapstick is the term that's most important for you to understand here and to remember. Linguistic slapstick was the thing that defined Amos and Andy and defined the most successful comedic radio programming. It was the great revelation for radio. It was the thing that people didn't know would become so important because Americans craved something about that. And that's what Susan Douglas is trying to explain here, is what about that was so potent and powerful and so necessary for their listeners. The third point I want to make here is, these points build on each other, is how listeners used Amos and Andy. Now, it's an interesting idea. You know, we're used to the concept of how manipulated listeners are by the programming material. But this idea that listeners, in turn, used their comedies to entertain them. We do this today. People channel surf and switch. They watch Family Guy or they watch The Simpsons. Many times they'll know these episodes by heart. People may watch one or two channels simultaneously. In a way, they're using their entertainment medium we're using our entertainment media to our own devices. What she's suggesting here is that people probably unconsciously used Amos and Andy. And the term she used, the term that's most important here, is this concept of cultural ventriloquism. So the idea is that Amos and Andy, in a way, were kind of like puppets for the viewers, for the listeners to sort of speak through Amos and Andy, largely unconsciously, because again, this is an era of enormous cultural tension, economic tension, and the power that people did not feel, largely, most listeners were on the bottom of the totem pole, were on the downside of that economic pole, craved an entertainment form, apparently craved an entertainment form in which there would be people like them in a certain way, like them in that they were powerless, that they were continually facing hardship, and who in a way could heroically sort of survive and champion and win out. Maybe not, certainly not in terms of win out by making it big, by striking it rich, by becoming powerful, but instead, through humor, could essentially make things okay for them. They could retain some grace. They could sort of frame the situation in which they retained some power, at least humorously. This action of using Amos and Andy like that, she refers to as cultural ventriloquism. And that's an important third point. Well, now here's my fourth point. She talks about the functions of comedy. Now, we understand that comedy's main goal is to entertain. That's its first and foremost function, is to entertain. It still is today. Most comedians, if you corner them, they'll say, I just want to get a laugh. But we know that comedy functions at deeper levels. And in this era, radio comedy certainly functioned in a very powerful way, more than just entertaining people. And I've already hinted at that. And she talks about it quite repeatedly in this chapter, that comedy engaged and articulated the tensions of class conflict. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean that it solved class conflict? No. Does that mean that it diffused class conflict? Perhaps. But in a way, it allowed Americans a way to grapple, in some ways to become aware that they were in a situation of power in which they were not uh, the haves, they were the have-nots. And again, the humor allowed people a way to kind of like have their peace with that. But it also kept their dignity, and she says it kept their flexibility and suppleness about life. And that's more than just entertaining people in a way that has an almost kind of a deeply spiritual function for people. And she boldly claims that this is what made Amos and Andy so famous and powerful and strong and popular because and effective is because they tapped a very deep need for Americans at this time to grapple with this very, very difficult sort of condition to their lives. So comedy functioned to engage and articulate class conflict. Now there's a fifth point I want to make here, and it's a small detail, but it's worth knowing. Amos and Andy, it kind of reveals what I've said earlier about accent. Amos and Andy had girlfriends, and they appear in the comedy episodically. And interestingly enough, the girlfriends have one big difference, besides the fact that they're a different gender and so on. One big difference with their on-air personalities from Amos and Andy, and that is that the girlfriends spoke proper English. They pronounced well. They used English properly. And based on what we know, what that signified to listeners was that the girlfriends, essentially had more power, had more education, or more, perhaps more income, or some higher degree of assimilation, were a bit more mainstream, something. And this is an interesting thing because this becomes a kind of a stock relationship throughout the next 40 years of sitcom, in which you have women who are more powerful than the men in these comedic relationships. This is not 100% the case, but it is a setup for that is predominant in sitcoms for the next 40 years, that power relationship between men and women, between those in power and those out of power. Okay, that gives you a kind of a summary and I touched through 5 different points there that are worth noting down and bringing with you when you come to the exam. If you have any questions, you can email me, but I think this will do quite well in getting you prepared for the exam. So thanks for listening to this.